Nobody inside the lobby looked at the old farmer twice when he stepped through the revolving doors that Thursday morning. His boots carried dried mud from county roads 40 miles outside the city, and the cuffs of his faded denim jacket were worn white with age. The security guard noticed him immediately, though. Men like Walter Boone always noticed people who looked out of place. The old man paused beneath the marble ceiling of Ashbury National Bank, holding a folded envelope carefully against his chest. Around him, customers moved between polished counters and touch-screen kiosks while investment managers guided wealthy clients toward glass offices upstairs. Nobody paid attention to the trembling slowness in the farmer's walk or the way he studied the room like someone entering a courthouse instead of a bank. Then the guard stepped forward. "Sir," Walter said flatly, "customer service is across the street." Several nearby clients glanced over. The farmer blinked once. "I'm here for an appointment." Walter's eyes traveled down toward the mud on the man's boots. "With who?" The old man unfolded a wrinkled paper from the envelope and adjusted his glasses. "Says here I'm meeting with someone from agricultural lending." Walter barely looked at the paper. "You got an account here?" The farmer hesitated. That hesitation was enough. "Look," Walter said quietly, lowering his voice into the tone security guards use before escalating situations, "we can save everybody some time if you head on out." The old man straightened slowly. "My name is Elias Turner," he said. "I drove 2 hours to be here." Walter crossed his arms. "And I'm asking you politely to leave." Near the reception desk, a young assistant stopped typing. An elderly woman waiting near the elevators lowered her newspaper slightly. The tension spreading through the marble lobby was subtle, but familiar. Wealthy institutions had a way of turning discomfort silent before turning it public. Elias looked down at the envelope again. Inside it was a certified letter carrying Ashbury National seal. He had read it 6 times before sunrise. Final notice regarding land collateral review. Most people would have called a lawyer. Some would have ignored it altogether. But Elias Turner came from a generation that still believed institutions could be reasoned with face-to-face. He had inherited 300 acres of Iowa farmland from his father, survived drought seasons in the 80s, and buried a wife who balanced every harvest ledger by hand for nearly 40 years. What frightened him wasn't debt. It was confusion. Because according to Ashbury National Bank, land that had been fully paid off since 1998 was suddenly attached to an unresolved lending dispute involving a commercial energy project Elias had never heard of. Walter took a firmer step forward. "Sir, if you don't leave willingly, I'll escort you out." The receptionist finally stood. "Maybe we should verify the appointment first." Walter didn't turn around. "I already handled it." Elias carefully returned the paper into the envelope. His hands shook slightly now. Not from fear. From anger. "I didn't drive here to cause trouble," he said. "I came because your bank sent me a letter threatening property my family's owned since Truman was president." That drew more eyes. Walter's jaw tightened immediately. Public scenes inside financial institutions made executives nervous. Customers nervous. Investors nervous. "Lower your voice. I'm speaking normally. You're disturbing clients." Elias glanced around the room. Nobody looked disturbed. Mostly uncomfortable. There was a difference. Before Walter could respond again, the elevator doors opened behind them with a soft metallic chime. Elias looked down at the envelope again. Inside it was a certified letter carrying Ashbury National seal. He had read it 6 times before sunrise. Final notice regarding land collateral review. Most people would have called a lawyer. Some would have ignored it altogether. But Elias Turner came from a generation that still believed institutions could be reasoned with face-to-face. He had inherited 300 acres of Iowa farmland from his father, survived drought seasons in the 80s, and buried a wife who balanced every harvest ledger by hand for nearly 40 years. What frightened him wasn't debt. It was confusion. Because according to Ashbury National Bank, land that had been fully paid off since 1998 was suddenly attached to an unresolved lending dispute involving a commercial energy project Elias had never heard of. Walter took a firmer step forward. "Sir, if you don't leave willingly, I'll escort you out." The receptionist finally stood. "Maybe we should verify the appointment first." Walter didn't turn around. "I already handled it." Elias carefully returned the paper into the envelope. His hands shook slightly now. Not from fear. From anger. "I didn't drive here to cause trouble," he said. "I came because your bank sent me a letter threatening property my family's owned since Truman was president." That drew more eyes. Walter's jaw tightened immediately. Public scenes inside financial institutions made executives nervous. Customers nervous. Investors nervous. "Lower your voice. I'm speaking normally. You're disturbing clients." Elias glanced around the room. Nobody looked disturbed. Mostly uncomfortable. There was a difference. Before Walter could respond again, the elevator doors opened behind them with a soft metallic chime. 3 people stepped into the lobby wearing dark executive coats against the February cold. One carried a leather portfolio. Another checked messages on a tablet while walking. The third man moved slower than the others, silver-haired, tall, with the restrained posture of someone used to rooms quieting when he entered them. Walter noticed him instantly. Every employee did. Because Richard Holloway wasn't just another executive. He was the regional director overseeing 12 Ashbury branches across 3 states. Walter immediately stepped away from Elias and straightened his uniform posture. "Morning, sir." Richard nodded once while removing leather gloves. Then he stopped walking. His eyes settled directly on the old farmer near the center of the lobby. For one strange second, the director's expression changed. Not confusion. Recognition. The assistant near reception noticed it first. So did Walter. Richard stared at the old man holding the weathered envelope. Then he said 4 words that changed the atmosphere of the entire building. "Mr. Turner came personally." Silence spread across the marble lobby. Walter looked between them uncertainly. "You know him?" the guard asked carefully. Richard never answered immediately. Instead, the director walked toward Elias himself. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried the kind of tension powerful people rarely showed in public. "Someone should have called my office the moment he arrived." Nobody in the lobby moved for several seconds after Richard Holloway spoke. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and impossible to ignore. A moment earlier, Walter Boone had been preparing to remove an elderly farmer from the building. Now senior employees were suddenly standing straighter, quietly watching the regional director approach the same man with visible concern. Elias Turner looked equally confused. "You know my name?" he asked cautiously. Richard stopped a few feet away. "I know your property." That answer only deepened the silence. Walter's confidence evaporated fast. "Sir, I didn't realize." "No," Richard interrupted calmly, "you didn't." The director extended his hand toward Elias. The old farmer hesitated before shaking it. Richard's grip was careful, respectful, and unusually formal for a man responsible for billions in regional assets. "Mr. Turner," Richard said quietly, "would you come upstairs with me?" Elias glanced around the lobby. Half the room was pretending not to stare. "I just wanted someone to explain this letter." "You'll get an explanation." Walter shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Sir, should I notify compliance?" Richard turned toward him for the first time since entering the lobby. "Yes," he said. "And tell them I want the original collateral file brought to conference room B immediately." Walter swallowed. The original file? The complete file. That wording mattered. Inside major financial institutions, complete file usually meant internal records not normally shown during customer disputes. It meant archived approvals, executive correspondence, legal attachments, and lending histories dating back years. Which meant whatever problem involved Elias Turner was larger than a routine banking error. Richard guided the old farmer toward the private elevators while assistants scrambled silently around them. Behind the reception desk, two employees exchanged nervous glances. The receptionist who had tried defending Elias earlier lowered her eyes toward the desk, suddenly understanding why the director himself looked unsettled. Elias stepped into the elevator slowly. The doors closed. Only then did he speak again. "What exactly is happening here?" Richard removed his glasses briefly. "Honestly, I'm trying to figure that out myself." The elevator climbed in silence toward the executive floor. Elias studied the man beside him carefully. Richard Holloway looked nothing like the people who usually visited rural counties promising financial partnerships. He spoke softly, dressed conservatively, and carried himself like someone exhausted by years of corporate damage control. "You said you know my property." Richard nodded once. "Turner Farms borders the North River expansion corridor." Elias frowned immediately. "Expansion corridor?" Richard looked toward the elevator numbers before answering. There was a renewable energy project proposed outside Grayson County 4 years ago. Large-scale commercial development. Storage facilities. Transmission infrastructure. Private investment groups. Ashbury financed part of the acquisition phase. "I never signed anything. That's what concerns me." The elevator doors opened onto the executive level. Conference Room B sat at the end of a long glass hallway overlooking downtown. Inside waited a polished walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and enough legal paperwork stacked neatly at one seat to make Elias uneasy before he even sat down. Richard closed the door behind them. "Coffee?" "No." Richard nodded. "Probably wise." Elias remained standing. "I'd rather hear the truth first." The director took a slow breath. "Mr. Turner, approximately 4 years ago, a subsidiary attached to a commercial energy consortium began purchasing easement rights and agricultural parcels near Grayson County. Most owners sold voluntarily. And the rest? There were legal disputes." Elias stared at him carefully now. "My land was never for sale." Richard opened a folder already waiting on the table. "That's exactly why I'm concerned this letter exists." He slid a photocopied document across the table. Elias adjusted his glasses again. At first glance it looked like standard collateral paperwork. Loan identification numbers. Agricultural classifications. Asset references. But halfway down the page, one line froze him completely. Secondary Land Access Agreement, Turner Property Tract 14C. Elias looked up instantly. "That's not my signature." "I know. You already knew." Richard leaned back slowly. "Mr. Turner, I reviewed your file after compliance flagged your account 3 days ago." "Why would they flag it now?" "Because the energy project collapsed." Elias frowned. "Collapsed how?" "Federal investigation." The room became very quiet. Richard continued carefully. "There are allegations involving inflated land valuations, unauthorized collateral packaging, and acquisition irregularities connected to multiple rural properties." Elias stared at the paper again. "My farm got mixed into this?" Richard's silence answered before his words did. "Possibly without your knowledge." The old farmer lowered himself slowly into the chair. For the first time since arriving, he looked tired instead of angry. "My wife handled our records before she passed," he said quietly. "Every payment receipt. Every county filing. Every tax form." He tapped the paper carefully. "This isn't hers. She would have spotted this immediately." Richard folded his hands. "That may be exactly why someone assumed they could bury it." Elias looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Richard could answer, the conference room door opened suddenly. A woman in a dark compliant suit stepped inside carrying 2 thick archive boxes. Behind her followed Walter Boone. And the moment the security guard saw the labels printed across the files, the color drained from his face completely. "Property Dispute Review, Internal Hold." Walter Boone immediately wished he had never touched the old farmer's shoulder downstairs. The archive boxes sitting on the conference table carried red compliance labels rarely seen outside litigation reviews. Even Elias, who knew little about corporate banking procedures, could sense the tension tightening across the room the moment the files appeared. The woman who carried them introduced herself calmly. Dana Mercer, Senior Compliance Counsel. She placed both boxes carefully beside Richard Holloway before looking toward Elias. Mr. Turner, thank you for waiting. I didn't exactly have much choice. Dana accepted the remark without reacting. Lawyers inside large institutions learned quickly which emotions were useful and which ones were expensive. Walter remained near the doorway. Richard noticed immediately. You can wait outside. Yes, sir. But before the guard could leave, Dana opened the first archive box and paused. Actually, she said quietly, Mr. Boone should stay. Walter froze. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Dana pulled a sheet from the file. Because his name appears in the access history. Now everyone in the room looked at Walter. The guard blinked once. What? Dana turned the document toward Richard first. Internal records show someone accessed the Turner Collateral Archive 11 months ago using Boone's employee credentials. Walter's face tightened instantly. That's impossible. Is it? I work downstairs, he snapped. I don't handle loan files. Richard spoke evenly. Then explain why your credentials were used. Walter looked genuinely confused now. I don't know. Dana studied him for several seconds before continuing. Access occurred at 9:14 p.m. after business hours. Security logs show the file remained open for 32 minutes. Walter shook his head harder. I wasn't even in the building that late. Richard folded his arms. Can you prove that? The guard opened his mouth, then stopped. Because most hourly employees inside financial institutions rarely tracked ordinary evenings from nearly a year earlier. Dana pulled another page from the folder. Security footage from that date was automatically deleted after 90 days. Walter looked sick now. Elias watched the exchange quietly, his instincts shifting. For the first time since arriving, he no longer felt like the only vulnerable person in the room. Richard sat slowly beside the archive boxes. Dana, he said carefully, tell me exactly what compliance believes happened. She nodded once. Preliminary review suggests multiple rural properties tied to the North River project may have been improperly categorized as contingent collateral during financing negotiations. Elias frowned immediately. English. Dana turned toward him respectfully. Someone may have temporarily attached your farm to investment paperwork without your permission. Why? Because lenders prefer larger asset pools. Richard added quietly, especially for unstable commercial projects. Elias stared at the forged agreement again. And nobody noticed. Dana hesitated. That's the troubling part. She opened the second archive box. Inside sat older documents. Property surveys. Easement maps. Internal emails. Acquisition projections. Most carried dates from 4 years earlier, during the height of the energy development boom. Dana removed one sealed folder separately marked Executive Review Only. Richard's expression hardened immediately. That wasn't supposed to leave legal storage. Neither was the Turner file, Dana replied. She opened the folder carefully. Inside rested a single original document protected beneath transparent archival plastic. Elias leaned forward slowly. Even before Dana slid it across the table, he recognized the handwriting. Not the signature. The notes. Margaret Turner's handwriting. His late wife's small blue ink annotations filled the margins beside several financial terms. Property taxes verified. County release received. Mortgage satisfied in full. Elias stared silently. She reviewed this herself, he whispered. Dana nodded carefully. 3 months before she passed. Elias looked up sharply. Then how did my land end up connected to that project afterward? Nobody answered immediately. Because the question carried terrifying implications. If Margaret Turner had personally verified the farm's clean ownership status before her death, then somebody altered the records afterward. Intentionally. Richard finally broke the silence. Dana, who authorized the secondary collateral classification? Dana slid another document from the folder. No authorization signature exists. Richard frowned. That's impossible. Not entirely, Dana replied. During rapid acquisition periods, temporary classifications could be entered pending executive review. By who? Dana looked toward the bottom of the page. Then her expression changed. Richard noticed immediately. What is it? Slowly, Dana turned the document around. At the bottom sat a faded approval stamp beside an executive routing code. Richard stared at it without speaking. Elias watched him carefully. You recognize it? The director's jaw tightened. Yes. Walter shifted uneasily near the door. Sir. Richard never looked away from the paper. That routing code belonged to Thomas Vane. The room became still again. Even Dana looked uncomfortable now. Elias frowned. Who's Thomas Vane? Richard answered quietly. Former Executive Vice President of Commercial Acquisitions. Former. He resigned 8 months ago. Dana corrected him gently. Officially, he retired. Richard gave a humorless smile. Right before federal investigators subpoenaed project records. Elias leaned back slowly. So this whole thing's corruption. Dana responded carefully. We don't know that yet. Richard did not sound convinced. I think we do. Walter suddenly spoke from the doorway. Sir. I met that man once. Everyone turned toward him. Walter swallowed hard. Thomas Vane came here last year after hours. His voice lowered uncertainly. He asked me to let 2 consultants upstairs without logging them through reception. Dana's eyes sharpened instantly. What consultants? I don't know their names. Richard stood immediately now. Why didn't you report that? Walter looked ashamed. Because he said the director approved it. Silence. Then Richard spoke very softly. I never approved anything. And for the first time that morning, Elias Turner realized the problem inside Ashbury National Bank was far bigger than a forged document attached to his farm. Someone inside the institution had been cleaning records. Rain began tapping softly against the executive windows as Dana Mercer closed the archive folder. Nobody spoke for nearly half a minute. Inside Conference Room B, the tension had shifted beyond ordinary banking confusion. Elias Turner could feel it now in the way people paused before answering simple questions, in the careful wording, in the guarded looks exchanged across the table whenever Thomas Vane's name surfaced. Institutions only became this cautious when liability reached dangerous levels. Richard Holloway finally broke the silence. Walter, he said evenly, I need exact dates for every after-hours visit involving Vane or outside consultants. Walter nodded quickly. I'll pull what I can remember. No, Dana interrupted. You'll write everything down formally. Walter's face tightened again. Elias watched the younger man carefully. The guard looked less arrogant now than frightened. Whatever confidence he carried downstairs in the lobby had vanished completely. Walter cleared his throat. Am I in trouble? Dana answered honestly. That depends on whether you knowingly bypassed procedure. I didn't know what they were doing. Richard spoke quietly. That may not matter. Walter looked down at the floor. For a moment Elias almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The old farmer reached slowly into his envelope again. I brought something too. Dana looked up. What is it? Elias removed several folded papers held together with a rusted binder clip. The pages were yellowed, handwritten, and worn soft at the corners from years of handling. My wife kept copies of everything important at home, he said. Separate from the bank records. Richard leaned forward slightly. What kind of copies? Payment histories. County confirmations. Loan releases. Dana extended her hand carefully. May I? Elias passed the papers across the table. The compliance attorney studied the first sheet for only a few seconds before her posture changed entirely. These are original payoff notations. Richard stood beside her immediately. Dana pointed toward a faded county stamp dated June 14, 1998. Mortgage satisfaction acknowledged in full. Richard looked stunned. That should have closed every collateral attachment permanently. It did, Elias replied quietly. That's why I drove here instead of hiring a lawyer first. I thought somebody made a mistake. Dana continued reading. Then she stopped at another page. What's this? Elias adjusted his glasses again. My wife wrote notes during a meeting with Ashbury representatives years ago. Richard frowned. What representatives? Men asking questions about land access roads. Dana handed the page toward him. Margaret Turner's handwriting covered the bottom margin. 2 men returned asking about pipeline routes. Refused again. 1 mentioned state incentives. Did not trust either of them. Richard's expression darkened instantly. Pipeline routes? Dana looked up sharply. North River wasn't originally an energy storage project. Elias stared between them. What does that mean? Richard answered slowly. It means the project likely changed ownership structures multiple times before federal approval. Dana nodded grimly. Which creates opportunities to bury unauthorized land classifications inside reorganized filings. Elias exhaled through his nose. So they hid my farm inside paperwork. Possibly, Dana said. But these records help. Richard looked toward the old farmer carefully now. Mr. Turner, do you know how unusual this is? Elias shrugged faintly. Keeping records? Keeping records this complete. The old man's eyes drifted toward the rain outside. My father survived foreclosure threats during the 70s. After that, he trusted paper more than promises. Nobody argued with that. Dana reorganized the documents carefully into separate stacks. If these copies are authentic, and they appear authentic, they directly contradict the collateral attachment entered later. Walter spoke quietly from near the door. Then doesn't that prove the bank messed up? Dana looked toward him. No. It proves somebody altered procedural classifications after the loan closure. There's a difference. A massive one. Richard explained before Dana could continue. A banking error creates civil exposure. Intentional manipulation creates criminal exposure. Walter went pale again. Elias rubbed one tired hand across his beard. Who benefits from something like this? Richard answered immediately. Developers trying to increase project valuation. Dana added, especially during investor negotiations. Elias frowned. Using land they didn't own. Using land investors believed they controlled. The old farmer sat quietly with that thought. Outside the conference room windows, downtown traffic crawled through gray rain while somewhere below, ordinary customers continued opening checking accounts and applying for mortgages completely unaware of the crisis unfolding upstairs. Elias finally looked toward Richard again. You said federal investigators are already involved. Richard nodded slowly. Limited inquiry so far. But now? The director hesitated. Now came the difficult part. Dana answered instead. Now there's evidence an unauthorized collateral classification may have survived internal review despite prior mortgage release verification. Elias blinked once. That sounds expensive. Richard gave a humorless laugh. It sounds catastrophic. A knock interrupted the room before anyone continued further. An assistant stepped cautiously inside. Mr. Holloway. Yes. There's someone downstairs asking for the Turner file. Dana immediately stiffened. Who? The assistant swallowed nervously. He said his name is Thomas Vane. Silence crashed through the room. Walter actually stepped backward. Richard's expression hardened instantly. Is he alone? No, sir. The assistant looked visibly uneasy now. There are 2 attorneys with him. The silence itself became revealing. Dana Mercer closed the archive folder slowly, almost carefully, while Richard Holloway stared toward the doorway with the exhausted expression of a man watching an old problem return at exactly the wrong moment. Only Walter Boone looked openly panicked. He can't be here, the guard muttered. Richard turned toward the assistant. Where is he now? Private lobby near executive reception. Did anyone give him access upstairs? No, sir. Good. The assistant hesitated before adding, he specifically asked whether the Turner collateral review had already begun. Dana and Richard exchanged a look immediately. Elias noticed it. That means he knew I was coming. Neither executive answered. Which was answer enough. Richard finally spoke. Tell reception Mr. Vane can wait. The assistant nodded quickly and disappeared. The conference room door shut again. Walter looked toward Richard anxiously. Sir, if he's involved in this, shouldn't security remove him from the building? Richard rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. Thomas Vane still has standing relationships with half the investors tied to North River. Throwing him out publicly creates a tension we may not control. Dana disagreed immediately. He's already paying attention to this file. That alone is dangerous. Elias sat quietly observing both of them. For the first time since arriving at Ashbury National Bank, he realized the people around him were no longer discussing ordinary corporate risk. They were discussing containment. The old farmer folded his hands together carefully. You all seem more nervous about him than about the forged paperwork. Richard answered honestly. Because paperwork leaves trails. And him? People like Thomas Vane survive by making sure trails disappear. The room fell quiet again. Dana reopened one of the archive boxes and began sorting through internal communications more aggressively now. We need timelines, she said. Every modification attached to Turner Farms. Every executive authorization. Every access entry. Walter shifted uneasily. What if records were deleted? Dana did not look up. Then we determine who deleted them. Richard glanced toward Elias. Mr. Turner, there's something important you should understand. Large development projects often involve layered entities. Investment partnerships. Temporary holding companies. Infrastructure subsidiaries. If misconduct occurred, it may not trace directly to one person. Elias nodded faintly. But somebody still signed something. Yes. And somebody still profited. Richard did not argue with that either. Dana suddenly paused over another document. Richard. He walked over beside her. What is it? She turned the page toward him silently. Elias could not see the contents clearly, but Richard's expression changed immediately after reading the header. Projected Asset Consolidation Review. Below it sat a spreadsheet of agricultural parcels attached to valuation estimates. Most were highlighted in yellow. One was highlighted in red. Turner Property, Tract 14C. Estimated access value pending quiet acquisition. Elias leaned forward slowly. What does quiet acquisition mean? Dana answered carefully. Usually it refers to private purchase strategies intended to avoid raising market prices. Richard looked disturbed now. Not in collateral language. Dana nodded once. Exactly. Elias stared at the highlighted line. They plan to take my land. Richard corrected him softly. They plan to control it. The difference mattered. Ownership created legal battles. Control created leverage. Elias understood that much even without legal training. My wife said men kept asking about access roads, he murmured. One offered cash directly. Richard looked up sharply. When? About a year before she died. Did you report it? To who? County officials. Elias shook his head slowly. I told them no. Thought that ended it. Dana's voice lowered carefully. It may have made your property harder to obtain through normal channels. Walter looked sick again. So they attached it to financing instead? Nobody answered directly. A soft vibration interrupted the table. Richard checked his phone. Then his face hardened. He's moving. Dana looked up instantly. What? Thomas Vane just requested executive access authorization through internal credentials. Walter blinked. He still has credentials. He shouldn't. Dana stood immediately. That means somebody inside reactivated them. Richard was already heading toward the door. Lock these files down. Dana grabbed his arm first. Richard, listen carefully. If Vane came personally, he believed something survived inside these records. Richard looked toward the archive boxes. Then toward Elias. Finally, toward Walter. The guard swallowed hard under the weight of the room's attention. Richard spoke quietly. Walter, when Vane came here last year, did he access the executive archive room himself? Walter hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. Dana's eyes narrowed immediately. Answer the question. Walter looked trapped now. He didn't use a keycard. Richard frowned. Then how did he get inside? Walter's voice nearly dropped to a whisper. Someone from upstairs let him in. Who? Walter closed his eyes briefly. When he answered, the room went completely still. It was your deputy director. Richard stared at him. You mean Claire Donovan? Walter nodded once. And she told me the Turner file had already been handled. Richard Holloway remained motionless for several seconds after Walter Boone mentioned Claire Donovan's name. The stillness frightened everyone in the room more than anger would have. Elias Turner studied him carefully. Until now, Richard had looked like a senior executive trying to manage institutional damage. But this was different. Personal. The director's expression carried the quiet shock of a man realizing someone close to him might already be compromised. Dana Mercer spoke first. How certain are you? Walter answered immediately this time. Completely certain. Richard looked toward him sharply. You understand the seriousness of that accusation. Walter swallowed hard. I remember because she almost never came to the branch after hours. Dana crossed her arms. What exactly happened? Walter took a slow breath. It was around 8:30 at night. Mr. Vane arrived with 2 consultants carrying document cases. I stopped them because none of them signed in through reception. And then? Ms. Donovan came downstairs herself. Richard's jaw tightened. Walter continued carefully. She told me the visitors had executive authorization and said the meeting was confidential. Dana asked the obvious question next. Did she mention the Turner file directly? Walter nodded uneasily. She said legal review on the Turner property had already been resolved internally. Elias leaned forward slowly. Resolved how? Walter shook his head. She didn't explain. Richard finally spoke again, voice lower now. Claire worked under me for 9 years. Dana looked toward him carefully. Which means she understood compliance procedure better than almost anyone in this region. That's exactly why this makes no sense. But Elias wasn't convinced anymore. The old farmer had spent his entire life around land negotiations, crop contracts, insurance adjusters, and county officials. One thing experience taught him was simple. People rarely break rules accidentally when millions of dollars are involved. Dana reopened the archive folders again. We need to determine whether Donovan approved procedural bypasses or participated directly in classification changes. Richard nodded distractedly, already reviewing messages on his phone. She's not answering calls. That's not encouraging. No. Elias rubbed tired fingers against the edge of the table. Can somebody explain something to me? Richard looked up. If this project collapsed months ago, why does my land still matter? The question lingered heavily inside the room. Dana answered carefully. Because unresolved collateral exposure creates liability chains. Elias frowned. Meaning? Richard translated more plainly. If investors lost money, lawyers start tracing every represented asset tied to financing documents. And if my farm was listed? Then someone may try proving the classification was legitimate after the fact. Elias stared at him. Even if it wasn't? Richard's silence answered again. The old farmer leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time that day, genuine anger returned to his face. My wife spent 38 years protecting that land, he said quietly. She balanced every payment receipt down to the penny because she grew up watching banks take farms during bad harvest years. Nobody interrupted him. She used to say institutions don't steal land all at once anymore. Elias looked toward the rain-covered windows. They bury people under paperwork until nobody can fight back. Dana lowered her eyes briefly. Because the old man was not entirely wrong. A knock interrupted the room again. This time another executive assistant entered looking visibly nervous. Mr. Holloway. What now? Ms. Donovan just arrived downstairs. Richard stood immediately. Alone? Yes, sir. Dana noticed the assistant's hesitation. What else? She's asking why federal investigators are parked across the street. Silence. Richard stared at her sharply. Federal investigators? The assistant nodded nervously. 2 black sedans arrived 10 minutes ago. Dana cursed softly under her breath for the first time all morning. Elias blinked once. You didn't call them? No, Dana answered. Richard grabbed his coat from the chair. Then somebody else did. Walter looked horrified now. Thomas Vane. Most likely. Dana stood beside Richard immediately. If Vane contacted investigators first, he's trying to control the narrative. Elias frowned. Meaning? Richard answered grimly. Meaning he may claim the bank acted independently while he distances himself from the classifications. Dana added quietly, or he's sacrificing someone internally. The room understood the implication instantly. Claire Donovan. Walter looked toward the door anxiously. What do we do now? Richard made the decision quickly. Dana, secure every Turner-related file immediately. Already started. Walter, nobody accesses archive storage without my authorization. The guard nodded rapidly. Richard then turned toward Elias. Mr. Turner. I need you to stay here until we understand exactly what's happening downstairs. Elias gave a dry laugh. Funny thing is, 6 hours ago your guard was trying to throw me out of the building. Walter lowered his head immediately. Richard met the old farmer's eyes carefully. And now you may be the most important witness inside it. Before Elias could answer, Richard's phone vibrated again. He looked at the screen. Then all color drained slowly from his face. Dana noticed instantly. What? Richard raised the phone silently toward her. The message contained only one sentence. Check the Turner mortgage release signature again. Below it sat no name. Only an attached photograph. A photograph showing Margaret Turner signing documents. 3 months after her recorded date of death. Nobody spoke after seeing the photograph. Rain continued striking the executive windows while the image remained frozen on Richard Holloway's phone screen like something unreal. Elias Turner stared at the picture of his late wife signing papers dated months after her funeral, and for one terrible moment he almost doubted his own memory. Then anger steadied him again. That's fake, he said quietly. Dana Mercer nodded immediately. Most likely. Richard zoomed closer on the image. The timestamp matched an internal archive scan uploaded 7 months earlier. Margaret Turner sat at a conference table wearing a gray sweater, head lowered toward paperwork. Except Elias recognized the sweater instantly. She was buried in that sweater. Silence returned again. Dana looked toward Richard. Someone manufactured supporting documentation after the federal inquiry began. Richard nodded grimly. Which means they were trying to legitimize the collateral classification retroactively. Walter Boone leaned against the doorway looking pale. So Vane panicked. No, Dana corrected softly. He prepared. That distinction mattered. Panicked people destroyed evidence. Prepared people replaced it. Elias slowly removed one final folded paper from the envelope he had carried into the bank that morning. My wife prepared too. Richard looked up. What is that? A receipt. Dana accepted it carefully. Unlike the other records, this one carried notarization stamps and county verification seals. At the bottom sat Margaret Turner's handwriting beside a date from 3 weeks before her death. If any future claim appears against Turner Farm, request original county microfilm release. Dana read the sentence twice. Then her eyes widened. Richard noticed instantly. What? She looked up slowly. Because county microfilm records can't be altered remotely. Elias nodded once. My wife trusted physical archives more than computers. Richard grabbed his phone immediately. Call Grayson County Records Office. Dana already was. The room waited through 2 long minutes while rain hammered harder outside. Finally Dana lowered the phone slowly. They confirmed the original mortgage release still exists on county microfilm. Richard exhaled sharply. Then the forged collateral chain collapses. Dana nodded. Completely. Walter looked stunned. That's it? No, Richard replied quietly. That's evidence. Another knock interrupted them before anyone continued. This time 2 federal investigators entered beside executive security. Thomas Vane followed several steps behind. The former executive no longer carried the confidence of a powerful financier. His expensive coat hung open carelessly, and his expression tightened the moment he saw the archive boxes still sitting on the conference table. Especially when he saw Elias Turner beside them. One investigator spoke calmly. We're here regarding unauthorized agricultural collateral filings tied to the North River Development Consortium. Nobody moved. Thomas Vane looked directly toward Richard first. You involved federal review over a clerical issue? Richard answered coldly. You tried attaching a dead woman's signature to active lending documents. Vane's expression flickered. Only briefly. But long enough. Dana stepped forward holding Margaret Turner's notarized receipt. And county microfilm records just invalidated your entire collateral chain. The room became perfectly silent. Vane looked toward Elias then. For the first time all day, the old farmer stood completely steady. No shaking hands. No confusion. Just exhaustion and quiet certainty. My wife knew somebody would try this eventually, Elias said. That's why she kept copies of everything. One federal investigator extended a folder toward Vane. Thomas Vane, we need you to come with us. Vane looked around the room one final time, calculating, searching for support that no longer existed. He found none. As investigators escorted him away, Richard Holloway turned toward Walter Boone. Next time an old farmer walks into this building carrying paperwork, he said quietly, read the paperwork before judging the boots. Walter lowered his eyes. Elias picked up the worn envelope from the table and moved slowly toward the door. Then Richard called after him. Mr. Turner. Elias paused. Richard hesitated before speaking again. Your wife saved your farm. The old farmer gave a faint nod. No, he said softly. She saved the truth.